Hey everyone, we are going to speak now about some changes that were occurring in the Ottoman Empire, and specifically the tensions that were emerging between the new elite, between the frontier warriors, and the new elite that was being brought in, or rather developed, by people like Murad I and the Ottoman sultans as they searched for a more permanent solution to the kind of nomadic state that they had emerged from. So what we're really looking at is basically two groups that were increasingly at odds with each other. On one end, we have the frontier warriors, right? These nomadic Turkic generals and fighters who are part of the raiding groups and are kind of constantly pushing for a further expansion of the frontier and increased warfare, or rather, raiding against the villages of people in the Dar al-Harb, the land of war, basically the places beyond the border that are no longer formally Ottoman territories. And they all saw all of these movements to create the Janissaries, to create new tax structures, to develop a more centralized army, and a variety of other works as part of an attempt to constrain their freedom. Right? They wanted, they were really against centralization. They wanted the capital, kind of to the degree that they needed a capital to remain in Edirne, but they really wanted the Ottoman Empire, in this case not even an empire, but the Ottoman polity, to be one of frontier warriors. But at the same time, the Ottoman government, as it was trying to create something a bit more, let's say, stable or useful in terms of administration, was developing a new cadre of servants, of administrators, and of military leaders that they thought would be more loyal and more efficient. And so those new administrators were drawn from a few different places. Most specifically, they were kul, that is, slaves, right? We talked about how the janissaries and the elite administrators were actually drawn through slavery from basically the late 14th century, it's 1380s, until about the 1580s, 1620s, when it ended. So about for two centuries, 2.5 centuries, this was probably the predominant way of entering the elite, the ruling class, the one that's making the decisions about this. Not all of them were selected through the Dev Shimei. Some were just brought in as slaves that were bought and brought into the palace and trained there. Some were people captured, again, at sea or on land, and then again brought in as slaves if they showed promise, especially if they were the children of kind of important Venetian or Byzantine noblemen, etc. But there was also a lot, not just through slavery. They also decided to take in a number of former Byzantine leaders, especially their children, and integrate them into the ruling class of the empire. And part of this, of course, is a pragmatic reason that as this place is expanding quickly and they need loyal and efficient and savvy kind of sub-rulers, obviously they don't want to antagonize the people who are already there. It's easier to co-opt them and bring them in. And so often that's another group that they were drawing upon. And the third was migrating scholars. By migrate, I don't mean that they're moving between places, but for example, scholars are moving from Iran or from Cairo into the lands of Anatolia, seeking out essentially professional opportunity, right? This is a new and growing state. They need people who have some training in law. They need people who know how to run a treasury and how to collect taxes well, etc. So all of these are increased. These are the new kind of centralizing rulers and elite of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th and 15th century. And there's going to be a lot of tension between these frontier warriors and these new administrators. And if you look at the primary sources we've been talking about in class, you can see in even the very narratives about how the Ottoman Empire got started, you can see a tension between Sufis and Ghazis and the ulama. One last point: these migrating scholars, these ulama, these these figures, they're not recruited through slavery. They are freeborn Muslims. So that becoming a scholar, becoming a judge or a magistrate, etc., was one of the few ways that freeborn Muslims could enter into the ruling class of the empire. So how did this work of integrating these Christian elites into the Ottoman elite actually happen? Well, the most common way is to essentially raise the children of these elites in the palace. Sometimes they were brought in through slavery, but sometimes not. Sometimes they were kind of sent over to be trained as kind of quasi hostages / pupils, and this kind of introduced them to the Ottoman system, the Ottoman rulers, the princes, etc., and made them part of the system, which they could then go on and serve. Now, that said, beyond the elite, if we look just kind of like at everyday soldiers, again, there's lots of Christians already serving the Ottomans in general. So, for example, in Serbia, there's a lot of Christian soldiers that are just part of the Ottoman army as kind of irregulars or being paid to be part of it. So there are already many Christians in daily life, but we're talking about here about the elite. So let's look at one example. This guy named Mahmud Pasha Angelevic, basically alive in the 15th century. What you have here is a name. The first name is Mahmud. As you can tell, probably he's a Muslim, right? Pasha is a title. It's a military title, like a general or a military leader. Angelevic is the family name. He was just called Mahmud Pasha, but Angelevic shows that he was kind of born. He has a Slavicized name that we use to describe him as compared to other Mahmud Pashas. So he was born in Serbia. He's actually the grandson of a very famous Byzantine elite family called the Philanthropanoi, the rulers of Thessaly, which is northern Greece, kind of the area that would become the core of the Ottoman Empire. But he was actually captured as a kid, and once it became clear who he was and what he was and his status, he was actually sent to the palace, and he was raised in the palace as essentially as a sort of princeling. And with that experience, having been raised in the palace, and then of course converted to Islam, probably sometime in his late teenagehood or early 20s, he enters into imperial service, and he climbs up the rank until he becomes, if you look at these dates, at the age of 36, basically, from 36 to 46, he becomes a grand vizier. What does that actually entail? It means he's running the government, but he's also leading campaigns, military campaigns, in the Balkans, in the same places that he had come from. And he was so well integrated, right, over time. He'd become so deeply educated in the Ottoman/Islamic system of government that one of the things that people learned to do, both sultans and grand viziers, and as well scholars and other people, was to write poetry. This was considered the height of culture. And he himself actually also wrote poetry under the name of Adni. So let's move on. To another example of a Christian child that was raised in Ottoman captivity, and that is Vlad III DRACULA. Again, living actually very similar times as our Mahmud Pasha, 1528, 1476, but with a very different ending. Now, you might know Vlad III by his more common name, which is Dracula, but it's important to know what's the connection between Dracula and the Ottoman Empire. Well, let us jump into that. So here is the map of what is today kind of Romania and Hungary, which were at the edge of the Ottoman kind of frontier in the 15th century. So in the 1400s, this is the area that the Ottoman armies were moving into. Today, Romania is kind of here, Moldova is here. You can see there's the Tatar countries, basically nomadic Turkic groups moving in from the northern Ukrainian steppe. And here's what is essentially parts of kind of Hungary and Serbia. Now, this area ended up being essentially run through vassals, right? So the Ottomans kind of conquered them, but they didn't create their own system of government here. They let them run it as long as they paid a tribute, and that they're technically they would elect a leader, and that he was then approved by the Ottoman government. One of the people that was one of the lords of this region was the father of Vlad Dracul, and as part of this agreement, he was to be sent out to the Ottoman Empire to be trained there as a child, and when he became an adult, he would actually be released and then become a loyal vassal subject. That was the idea, at least. He wasn't sent to Constantinople. He was actually sent to a fortress in Tokat, I believe, or in Amasya, which is in kind of central Anatolia. But he did receive the education, and he was released. But things turned out a bit. In fact, what happened is that he did not remain a loyal vassal. He became actually a quite difficult and rebellious vassal, in fact, attacking the Ottomans and a variety of other people, and became so ferocious that eventually his image melded with the image of bloodthirsty and despotic leaders of the 18th and 19th century, which melded into the birth of the vampire legend around the 18th and 19th century. Let's look at very quickly one description of him at that time. So here's a description, mostly from German sources or Slavic sources, which depict just how brutal he was. He specifically enjoyed torturing people. And so he apparently had a big copper cauldron built and put a lid on it made of wood with holes on the top. He put people in the cauldron and put their heads in the holes and fastened them there. Then he filled it with water and set a fire under it and let people cry their eyes out until they were boiled to death. Mostly he was actually known for impaling people, and this was actually even depicted in the 16th century printed woodblock materials from Europe. That's why he was actually called Vlad the Impaler, because he liked to stick people on giant staves. But that idea of just someone so utterly brutal and bloodthirsty, I think, kept circulating in this period. Now, there's actually a long tradition of vampire-like creatures in folklore, and we can even find examples of it in the court records, people who would dig up corpses and say that so-and-so, this corpse, was found to be basically not decomposed, and probably with a ruddy expression and maybe some blood on their lips, etc. And this was seen as an example of the harmful dead, the people that wouldn't die, the undead who were out there to torture the living. And reports of this actually started funneling in during a Habsburg campaign into the Balkans in the 1730s. From there, became part of popular news in Europe, and in the 19th century, Mary Shelley and others actually built upon this to create the current Dracula legend. So unfortunately, all the flying, the blood-sucking, the relationship with bats, all that's kind of a newer bit, but the general idea of the undead existed in the Balkans, specifically in the Balkans, and it combined with this figure, Vlad Dracul, who was himself an Ottoman vassal. He was eventually knocked down and put into place and stopped. But in the meantime, he had created a vision for himself as a particularly bloodthirsty individual.